Chapter 3. Trouble on the Road. At the curb stood a black sedan, its motor racing and its door open. Before the Hardys could reach it, the fugitives jumped inside and the car roared away in the dusk. "That's the car that picked up Dr. Bush," Joe exclaimed. "And look, the license plate is covered with mud." The boys gave up the futile chase and returned to the house. "One of those thugs might have been Dr. Bush," General Smith declared when he heard about the car. But Joe was doubtful and mentioned Chet's photograph. "The doctor has long legs, and neither of those fellows did." Mr. Hardy was trying to quiet his sister and at the same time get the story of the intruders. Those scoundrels! They said they were attendants from a mental institution," Aunt Gertrude sputtered. "Said that General Smith had escaped and they wanted to take him back. I said he was a friend of ours and they couldn't come in." "What did they look like?" Mr. Hardy queried. Aunt Gertrude peered over her eyeglasses. "Do you expect me to fight off two cutthroats and remember their looks at the same time?" she asked crisply, her fright gone. "I was too busy to notice. But one seemed a young man, about 21. He had a nice smooth complexion." Miss Hardy closed her eyes and shuddered. "Imagine such a young fellow trying to fight me. What's the world coming to?" "We'll find them, Aunt Gertrude," Joe vowed. "No, you won't," their aunt protested. "You'll not go chasing such criminals." "Oh, I knew when that woman telephoned. You should stay out of this. General Smith, we expect you to stay for dinner." As Aunt Gertrude slumped into a chair, General Smith said that he would be glad to stay and talk things over. "You see how things are, Fent. Will you handle the case for me?" "Yes," the detective replied evenly. "Finding the lost gold may be 1,000 to 1 chance. But it would give me great pleasure to nab the two thugs who tried to break into my house." "Fine," the general boomed. "You'll start immediately?" "Not so fast, Jack," Mr. Hardy said. "I must return to Washington tomorrow to testify in a case." General Smith looked disappointed. "But suppose Bush finds the gold before we do?" "We'll take care of that," Mr. Hardy assured. And then he turned to his sons. "You fellows can start south at once and lay to the groundwork." "Frank and Joe?" asked the officer in amazement. "Yes, indeed," Mr. Hardy replied proudly. "My boys help me on many cases. Sometimes they solve them before I do." "But this is different," continued the general, still hesitating. "This may be dangerous." He tugged at the lapels of his tunic, as if he were trying to make up his mind about something. "Then I'll accompany them to Rocky Run. I have a short leave due. We can stay at my house on the outskirts of Centerville. How soon can you boys start?" "Will tomorrow be soon enough?" Joe asked eagerly. General Smith smiled. "I can see no burglar would catch you boys napping." "We can stop overnight on the way," Frank mused, "and make Rocky Run sometimes the next day." A few minutes later, Chet, who'd been unaware of all the commotion, ran up from the basement waving a photograph. "Hey, do you like this one?" he asked enthusiastically. "It's a picture of a car with the license plate covered," Frank remarked. "How'd you happen to snap it?" Chet beamed. "It's the one that Dr. Bush rode away in." Joe reached for the picture as Chet, bursting with pride, said, "Guess I'd make a pretty good detective myself, eh?" "The same car was outside our house a short while ago," Mr. Hardy told Chet, and relayed his sister's encounter with the two thugs. Then Frank and Joe told their friend about the planned trip south, and Chet's face fell. "Gee, just when I thought we were going to have some fun with my camera, and you're going away." Frank, winking at his brother, said, "Say, Chet, you know we might need a good photographer on this case. How would you like to come along?" "Oh, boy," Chet beamed. "I might even get to photograph the other half of that crook." The general smilingly agreed to take Chet with them, and the boy hurried home to pack. "We'd better do some packing ourselves," Frank told his brother, and they went upstairs. Their mother, who'd been out shopping and had just returned, looked in on them. "Good gracious!" exclaimed the attractive woman, amazed at the piles of clothes on the bed. "Another trip?" The boys told of their plans. She smiled knowingly. "I'll miss both of you. Are you taking the proper clothes?" "We'll be outdoors most of the time," Frank replied, "exploring an old battlefield." At the mention of a battlefield, Aunt Gertrude, who had come upstairs, burst out, "You're taking too much risk. Why, there may be hidden shells that might explode, and that heat down south. Watch out for sunburn. Dinner's ready." Aunt Gertrude, who had the habit of hopping from one subject to another, hustled downstairs to the kitchen. Her cooking was as savory as her language was peppery. And as a special treat for Frank and Joe, she'd baked an apple pie. When she brought in the dessert, the boys were delighted. "Goodness knows when you'll eat properly again," she said tartly. "At least you should start the trip well fed." General Smith thanked the Hardys and said good night shortly after dinner. Later the boys were deeply engrossed in their books of Civil War history when 3 loud knocks sounded on the front door. "That's Chet," Frank assumed, recognizing the signal that the boys used. "Guess he has some news that couldn't wait till tomorrow." As Frank opened the door, 4 laughing young people burst into the Hardy home. In the lead was Iola Morton, Chet's sister, with Callie Shaw and Helen Osborne following. Chet brought up the rear with 2 large packages. "Surprise!" Callie called gleefully. The pretty blonde girl, a special friend of Frank for several years, took a big white cake box from Chet and set it gingerly on the hall table. "This is a bon voyage party," announced the black-haired Iola, Joe's favorite date, who was just as slender and good-looking as her brother was rotund. "Here, take this bag, Joe, but be careful. It's soda pop." Frank and Joe carried the refreshments into the kitchen, while Helen and Chet went to find the boys' latest dance records. "Don't y'all forget it," Iola teased Joe, "to bring back a good southern accent." "We'll leave that to your brother," Joe retorted, grinning. "He all can learn it while he's eating the fried chicken." After chatting about the trip and dancing until 10 o'clock, the young people sat down at the dining room table for refreshments. And then, bidding fond farewells to the Hardy boys, the girls left with Chet, and they chugged home in his old jalopy. The following day, prior to their departure, the 3 boys sat down with the General and Mr. Hardy to discuss the mystery. "This is like the briefing of the troops before a battle," the officer smiled. He gave the boys the layout of the territory around Rocky Run. "It's not going to be easy finding the treasure," he added. "I have a feeling you may run into trouble," Mr. Hardy remarked. "You boys must be constantly on alert. Gold is always the source of—" Suddenly, a splintering crash cut through the air. A dark object hurled through the window hit Frank full in the chest. Quickly, Joe dashed outside, but no one was in sight. Then he returned to the living room, where Mr. Hardy was holding a large, heavy stone. "That rock could have killed Frank if it had hit him on the head," Aunt Gertrude declared hotly. In a few minutes, Frank was able to breathe more easily. A bruise on his chest was the only apparent injury caused by the mysterious assailant. "Why would anybody want to hurt Frank?" asked Miss Hardy, still trembling from the shock. "I don't think Frank was the target," the detective replied. "I'm sure the stone was either meant for me or General Smith." "To keep you from looking for the gold," Frank put in. "I doubt whether it's worthwhile to call the police on this instant," Mr. Hardy said. "The fellow is probably far from here by now. But one thing is evident. Your movements, Jack, are being carefully watched by some dangerous criminals. I'd advise you to lay low today and wait till tomorrow to start south." It was agreed that both Chet and the General would stay overnight at the Hardy home to ensure an early start the following day. By morning, Frank was himself again, and eager to be off. While the group ate a hearty breakfast, Mr. Hardy and 2 of his operatives checked the neighborhood for suspicious characters who might be spying on the Hardys, but none were found. Shortly before dawn, with farewells ringing in their ears, the Hardy boys, Chet Morton, and General Smith set off. Chet looked very adventurous with his camera slung over a shoulder, and a folding tripod in a leather sheath which hung from his belt. With Frank at the wheel, they rode out of Bayport, soon in their sporty convertible, and they were miles away on the state highway. The boys found the general an interesting companion, with his stories of military life. Presently getting down to details of lost gold, they discussed the message, which was their only real clue. They all agreed on the possibility that the CSA stood for Confederate States of America. "Before we do anything else," Frank said, "I believe we ought to look over the battlefield and the plantation." Late that afternoon, the four travelers reached their stopover point. They registered at a large hotel, in the basement of which was a garage. When Frank drove the convertible inside, he said, "I'm leaving it for the night. My brother or I will call for it in the morning." The group registered, ate dinner, and went to bed early. After breakfast the next day, Joe went out for the car and presented the claim check. "Listen, Bud, nobody's taken that car except the guy who left it," the attendant declared. "I'm his brother." "Yeah, so is that other boy his brother?" "What are you talking about?" Joe demanded. "I'll discuss it with the guy who drove the car in here," the attendant insisted. Seeing that it was useless to argue, Joe went off for Frank. When they returned, the garageman related that a young man, not much older than the Hardys, had come in half an hour before, saying that he was one of the Hardy boys. "He didn't have a claim check," the man said, "so I wouldn't let him take the car." "He was trying to steal it?" Joe exclaimed. "What did he look like?" Frank asked. "Blonde, about your age. Wore blue pants and a sport shirt." Frank thanked the garageman, and the brothers climbed into the convertible. As Joe drove out to pick up Chet and the general, both Hardys had the same thought. Aunt Gertrude had said one of the intruders at the house had been very young. Had the boys been trailed? Out on the highway once more, the travelers amused themselves with the car radio as the miles rolled by. As usual, Chet became hungry long before the others. Seeing a pleasant-looking restaurant with a sign "Southern Fried Chicken," he begged them to stop. An hour later, having had a delicious lunch, they were on the road again, with Frank at the wheel. After a few miles, as the beautifully verdant countryside slid past, Frank looked into the rear-view mirror. "See that car back there?" he asked Joe, who was beside him. His brother turned in the seat and peered behind. A black sedan was following 100 yards back. "Looks as if it's trailing us," Joe said. Frank slowed down, and the other car did likewise. Then he sped up, and the trailing sedan kept pace. "I don't like this," General Smith said. Scarcely were the words out of his mouth when the Hardy's engine began to sputter. As Frank guided the vehicle up a gentle hill, the accelerator suddenly failed to respond. He steered to the side of the road, losing speed all the while. As he did, the sedan suddenly shot forward alongside the Hardy car. In a split second, it cut sharply in front of the car. Frank jerked the wheel quickly to the right and jammed on the brakes. Joe was hurled against the windshield. Chet and the general pitched halfway over the front seat. The car skidded on the sandy shoulder of the road, its front wheels teetering on the brink of a deep gully. End of Chapter 3.